I think dip pens are the best pens for drawing, so why don't more people use them? I think more people would use them if they knew where to start. That's why I wanted to make this series to give you an introduction to dip pens for drawing. This video is part 1, which is about nibs and nib holders. Part 2 will be about inks and papers, and part 3 will be about techniques for pen and ink drawing, such as pen control, cross-hatching, and stippling. So why should you use dip pens? For one thing, you can use dip pens with a wide variety of inks, including acrylic ink, which I think is the best kind of ink for drawing. For another thing, you can use dip pens to make a wide variety of marks. Thin lines, thin to thick lines, thick to thin lines, thin to thick to thin to thick to thin lines, or you can stipple or scribble. Dip pens are also cheap compared to fountain pens, for example, which can be hundreds of times more expensive. So you don't have to spend a lot of money to try them, and you can probably afford to try a lot of different kinds of nibs and nib holders to see which ones you like. Nibs and nib holders are separate parts. You can buy them separately, and you can use many different nibs with one holder, even if you buy them from different manufacturers. But, and this is a big but, there are two different types of nibs. Nibs that look like a circle where you put them into the nib holder. These are sometimes called crow quills, mapping nibs, or tubular nibs. And other nibs, which don't look like a circle, but only a section of a circle. Most nibs are like this, and most of them fit in so-called universal holders, but crow quills need a different kind of holder. This is a universal nib holder. It's wooden, and it has a metal insert that holds the nib. You can adjust the metal bits with pliers to fit your nib a bit better. These are supposed to work with all standard nibs, not crow quills, but I don't think they work very well with some of the nibs I'll show you. You should try different things to see for yourself what you like, but I think you should try a plastic nib holder with a plastic insert. I think these work better for a wider range of nibs. These are the nib holders I use for standard nibs. This one is made by Speedball, and it's plastic. This one is made by William Mitchell, and it's plastic. This one is made by Tachikawa, and it's wooden, but it has a plastic insert. So if you like the look and feel of wood, but you don't want a metal insert, then this is a good nib holder. This is the Tachikawa T25. The Tachikawa has a 2-in-1 insert that can hold both kinds of nibs, standard nibs and crow quills. All three of these standard nib holders are slightly different in size. The Mitchell is the tightest, the Speedball is the loosest, and the Tachikawa is somewhere in between. If you have a nib that feels too loose in the Speedball holder, you could try it in the Mitchell holder, but you could probably force any of these holders to work for any standard nib if you had to. These are the other nib holders I use for crow quills. This one is made by Speedball, and it's plastic. This one is made by Mitchell, and it's also plastic. It's often sold together with this crow quill made by Gillott, and sometimes it's sold as a reversible pen holder or a reversible mapping nib or something similar. You can reverse the nib and store it inside the holder, which is kind of nice. And you don't have to use it with the Gillott crow quill, even if you buy them together. You can also use it with other tubular nibs. All three of these quill holders are fairly similar in size and fit. There are a lot of nibs in the world, and you should try a lot of them if you can to see what you like. But this is an introduction, and I want to show you some of the most well-known nibs, which are also some of the best nibs I've tried. But first, I want to show you this book. This is the standard book on pen and ink drawing, Rendering in Pen and Ink by Arthur Guptill. If you like this video, please check out this book, but please also like and subscribe so I know I should make more videos about dip pens. The first edition of this book was published in 1930, but this edition is still in print, and it tells us that in 1825, about 100 years before the first edition was published, there was a company called Gillott that made steel nibs in England, and they were some of the best nibs. And there is still a company called Gillott that makes steel nibs in England, and they're certainly not bad. Now, 1825 is a long time ago, and who knows if these are really the same nibs as they used to be, but you can still buy a Gillott nib. I've tried all of the nibs that this book recommends, and I like these three the best. The Gillott 303, the Gillott 404, and the crow quill, also known as the Gillott 659, the nib that comes with the reversible holder. I live in England in spite of my accent, and I suspect these nibs are cheaper here than they are in other countries. I've had fun using supposedly the same nibs as Arthur Guptill, but there are good alternatives if you can't find them, or if you can't find them at a good price. I like the 303 and 404 in the Mitchell holders, and I don't like the 303 in the Speedball or Tachikawa holders, which are too loose for the 303, but which work all right with the 404. I like the Gillott crow quill in any of the crow quill holders I've shown you. The crow quill and the 303 have very fine points, and they can go from very thin to very thick lines. The 404 is broader and tougher, but it's also much firmer with less flexibility. Flexibility can be a lot of fun, and I don't want to spoil your fun, but you may want to start with a firmer nib. The 404 is probably better for beginners than the 303 or the crow quill, both of which can easily catch on the paper and both of which can take some getting used to before you can control the flex. The 404 is also good for stippling. If you live in North America, it might be easier to find these nibs, which are sold by Speedball, the Hunt 102 and Hunt 107, both of which fit all the crow quill holders I showed you, and the Hunt 512 and the Speedball B6, both of which fit the Speedball standard holder well, and fit the other two holders less well, or not at all, depending on how much force you use and how rusty or inky they get. And this part of the nib will probably get rusty or inky, but some nibs seem to rust more than others. It's not necessarily a problem, but it may be hard to get a rusty or inky nib out of its holder without wrecking it, and you may need to use pliers. Rust or built-up ink on the tines or the tip of the nib is a bigger problem, and you should try to keep them clean, but I'll talk about that in part 2. The Hunt 102 is probably the most well-known nib used by comic book artists in North America. Like the Gillott 659, the Hunt 102 is also called a crow quill, and you can use them both in the same nib holders, but they're actually rather different nibs. The Hunt 102 is slightly broader and much firmer than the Gillott 659, but even so, the Hunt 102 is a fine-tipped and flexible nib compared to nibs like the Gillott 404. I think the Hunt 102 is probably better for beginners than the Gillott 659 since it's firmer. The Hunt 107 is called a hawk quill, but it fits the same holders as the crow quills. It's firmer and finer than the Hunt 102, and it's good for lines with a constant width rather than a variable width. It doesn't flex very much at all. The Hunt 512 has a slightly broader tip and a moderate amount of flex. It's more flexible than the Gillott 404, but it's also good for stippling. It makes dots that are not too large, not too small in my opinion, and they're relatively round. The Speedball B6 doesn't have very much flex at all, and it's much broader than the other nibs I've shown you, but it's also a very different kind of nib. The tip is rounded, so it's easy to use in any direction, and the width of the line doesn't change with the direction of the line. Sometimes I really want that freedom of movement and that consistent line weight, and that can be hard to get with other dip pens. It might be the easiest nib for beginners to use because it's the most similar to other types of pens, like fountain pens or ballpoint pens. You can even use it upside down to get finer lines, but you may need to grind or polish the tip to get it to work well. This is called reverse writing with fountain pens, but I guess this should be called reverse drawing. Some other nibs can do it too, but I particularly like it with this kind of nib. It also has this extra part on the nib, which is called a reservoir. It holds extra ink, so you don't have to dip it as often. This is really useful. If you're interested in hand lettering your drawings for comic books, graphic novels, or manga, then I should say that the Speedball B6 and the Hunt 107 are recommended by the DC Comics Guide to Coloring and Lettering Comics by Mark Chiarello and Todd Klein. They note that you may need to file down the Speedball B6 to get a point that you like, but that's something for another video. Please let me know in the comments if that's something you'd like to watch, or if there are other things you'd like me to make videos about. This is my first video on this channel, and I'd like to know what kind of content would be most useful to you. This is the Zebra G nib, which is probably the most well-known nib used by manga artists, and it should be easy to find, or if not the Zebra G, then other G nibs made by Tachikawa, Nikko, or Leonardt. It fits the Tachikawa holder and the Speedball holder, and it's a fine and moderately flexible nib, but not as fine or flexible as the Gillott crow quill, for example. Like Gillott, Leonardt is also a company in England that has a long history of making nibs. Like Zebra, Leonardt also makes a G-nib. Like Speedball, Leonardt also makes a range of nibs with ink reservoirs, much like the Speedball B6. This is the Leonardt 400 series, which comes in a range of sizes. These are also called ornamental nibs. They're great for consistent line weight, but they need a lot of pressure. They're very firm, even firmer than the Speedball B series, which also comes in a range of sizes, but I don't have any of them other than the B6, which is the smallest size. Most Leonardt nibs are standard nibs, and they fit the Speedball and Tachikawa holders well, but the 400 series is slightly smaller and fits better, but very tightly, in the Mitchell holders. I also like the 400 series in the wooden holders with the metal inserts. I think these nibs deserve to be better known for drawing, together with the Speedball B series. This is the Leonardt 801 nib, which is also called a mapping nib, but it fits the crow quill holders. It has a very fine tip, maybe not quite as fine as the Gillott crow quill, but finer than the Hunt crow quill. It's firmer than the Gillott crow quill, but not quite as firm as the Hunt crow quill. It has a fantastic springiness or snappiness, and I really like the feel of it, but of course you need to try these nibs for yourself to see what you like. The Leonardt 700 and the Leonardt 6H have a special red wooden holder with a plastic insert. They're not varnished, and I painted this one black with acrylic ink. They're smaller than the standard size, but you can force them into the Speedball holder. The 700 is fine and flexible and somewhat similar to the Gillott 303. The 6H is slightly broader, much firmer, and somewhat similar to the Hunt 107. And there's also the 256, which is broad and somewhat similar to the Gillott 404. So that's an introduction to the nibs and the nib holders that I use. These are some of the most well-known nibs for drawing, and also some of the nibs that I just like. Some are fine and flexible, others are broad and inflexible, and some are in between those two extremes. I put these nibs into these categories myself. This is not some sort of standard system of categorizing nibs, and someone else would probably put them into different categories. But I think this is a useful way to think about the differences between these nibs. I often use a fine, flexible nib together with a broad, inflexible nib. I've tried to show you samples of each nib, but these should not be seen as rigorous scientific comparisons, and the variations you see are partly due to differences between the nibs, but partly due to differences in how steady or unsteady my hand was when I showed you each of them. The nibs in each of these categories are fairly similar, and the one you like best will probably be about how it feels when you use it, or how the ink flows from it, rather than the kind of line that it would technically be possible to make with it if you were a robot. Please let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with these categories, and let me know if you've tried these nibs and which are your favorites and why. Whichever one of these nibs you try first, it probably won't be the only nib you use. I often use more than one nib at a time, but I think you can do a good drawing with any one of these nibs, so try not to worry too much about which nib you should try. Just try one and see if you like it. You have to start somewhere, and I hope this video is as good a place to start as any, so have fun, and thanks for watching, and please keep an eye out for part 2 in this series.